Hey there. Just reading chapter 4, verse 4 of the Tao Te Ching in William Scott Wilson's translation with Shambhala. And I was thinking about the series I've been doing on the Tao Te Ching and philosophy. And I want to share this incredible verse with you and explore some of it with you today. It says, it's very short and incredibly profound. It says, the way, or the Tao, is as empty as an empty bowl. Yet when used, it never fills. Deep and ill-defined, it resembles the distant ancestor of all things. It blunts sharp edges, unravels their tangles, softens their blazing light, and blends one with their dust. Gentle and overflowing, it always seems to be there. I don't know who gives it birth. It appears to proceed, creator of us all. This is remarkable, isn't it? Beautiful. So much here, so deep, so difficult. And what I want to do is in this short, maybe 25 minutes, I want to explain to you some of the basic ideas or non-ideas, as we'll see in this video. And I want to introduce those who are part of watching this series or who are new to it. I want to introduce all of you to a deeper level of my own philosophy that's very much influenced by the Tao and this specific text, the Tao Te Ching, and this specific verse. And there's many things one could teach about this verse. And again, I think the Taoist sages, that they would be their own right authority. I'm teaching this from the standpoint of my own understanding as a philosopher who's integrating the Tao with my background, particularly in Western science and Platonism, and Jewish philosophy, Greek philosophy, and other contexts that I know. So I want to start with the opening sentence. The way is as empty as an empty bowl, yet when used, it never fills. So this verse is answering very directly the question we explored in the beginning of the series, which is, how do you know what the Tao or the way is like? We've seen that the Tao is very practical. We looked at verse 8 for 2 videos, and we saw this idea that the greatest good is like water. Water's virtue is that it benefits all creatures but contends with none. It dwells in places most men hate, thus it takes after the way. And I explained, and the rest of the verse goes on to say, for a place to live, the land itself is considered good. For the mind, depth is considered good. For society, sympathy is considered good. For speaking, standing by one's words is considered good. For governance, managing the flow is considered good. For actual events, ability is considered good. For movement, the right timing is considered good. So listen, only in non-contention is there no blame. And I showed how much practical profundity we have in that. And I want to use that now to anchor this, that the greatest good is like water. What does this mean? The way is as empty as an empty bowl. Well, let me remind you of the verse I quoted in the beginning of this series, 42, which says that the 10,000 things come from existence, but existence comes from non-existence. So what I really want to explain today is the idea of existence or emptiness, and how it relates to the way or the Tao. It says that the way is as empty as an empty bowl, yet when used, it never fills. So that's obviously what we would consider a contradiction or a paradox. If you use a bowl, by definition, it has to fill. But the Tao is as empty as an empty bowl, and you can use it, but it never fills up. So what does that mean? It means immediately the Tao is exactly like the essence of what we think of as the height of magic, or that which gives immortality, the elixir of life, something that keeps generating life. No matter how much you use it, nothing is ever taken away from it. So there's an idea here that emptiness and non-existence is that which nothing can be taken away from, which is literally true. But if nothing can be taken away from non-existence, the idea would be nothing can come out of non-existence. And in Western philosophy, there's a very fundamental axiom, ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, ex nihil nihil fit, nothing arises or nothing comes. And so there's an apparent contradiction between Taoism, Buddhism, and many other forms of so-called Eastern philosophy and the Western philosophical context, related to Parmenides, the great sage who lived about a century or so in the time frame of Socrates, before Socrates' death, and was one of the most influential figures in the century up to Socrates' birth and life. And he gives us this idea that out of nothing comes. It's often attributed to Parmenides, a very great priest and magician of Apollo, the great god of mystery, revelation, destruction, law in the Greek world. And if you're interested in Parmenides, then the scholar you want to look at is Peter Kingsley. And I've reviewed his very magnificent book on Parmenides, and I've linked to that below in the description. So the question is, can anything come out of nothing? And then I just want to start with the idea that in the Tao, something comes out of nothing all of the time. It says existence is born from non-existence. And so what does that mean? Well, let me start with some historical background so you can see there's not a contradiction between the Western ideas and the Eastern ideas. In the Bible and in the ancient Near East, in places like the Akkadian civilization that gave rise to the Enuma Elish, a very old, earliest version of a creation story, like what we find in the Bible, that comes from at least around roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era. We have this story about the gods, and the gods make the world out of the bodies of other gods. It's very, very disturbing. But you find this motif in many places. The idea that the earth is made out of the reused carcass of something else. So you could say, why would people think that? Well, the first thing is that in a culture in which you are a living being and all of your life depends on consuming life, there's an idea that if something's living, it comes out of something that is living or was living, either by birth or by death through consumption. So the idea is living things come from other living things impart power to other living things. So that's the psychological background of this mythic motif that the earth is made out of the body of something. Now in the Bible, in Bereshit or Genesis, you don't have the same idea, although you have the same general context. And I can't explore now why the idea is shifted or how it relates, but there is an idea in Genesis 1. Many translations don't render this, but it's literally in Genesis 1, there are dragons. There's like great serpents, Leviathan. And this is literally the case. And so there is a great sort of idea of sea monsters that are in the chaos in the beginning of the Bible. And this is connected to these older ancient Near Eastern stories of the creation of everything. And so how does that connect to the Tao saying that existence is born from non-existence, or the way is as empty as an empty bowl, yet when used it never fills? So how is the way empty, usable, and yet it never runs out of its utility? What does that mean? Well, in the ancient world, the idea of existence was not some abstract idea of whatever existence means to a modern academic philosopher. The idea of existence is related to the idea of the capacity to do something or order or function. So there's a book, for example, on the ancient Near Eastern worldview, and the author of that book points out that in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, like in the Akkadian worldview, the Enuma Elish, or the Jewish story of the creation account later, the idea of the state of chaos is identical with, in a sense, non-existence. So there's a sense in which you can't say something exists from the ancient standpoint if it's unusable, right? So say you have a bunch of land and you could order it into a very beautiful place. You could cultivate it, so that there's food, agriculture, animals would come there, you can build a house, but you haven't done that yet. So right now, nothing exists there and nothing can exist. So relative to the things that are going to exist, the sort of relative chaos of the land is non-existence. And this is actually one of the most basic ideas of existence, that psychologically, we think of things as existing that are directly affecting us, or that are real and operative, that have order and cohesion. So this means the idea of existence is conceptually closely related to the idea of livingness or life. And so life, therefore, is connected with the capacity or the presence of something that can affect you or do something to you. A living being can move, it can change, it can absorb sunlight, even though plants can't move most of them in any quick way, we know they are moving internally and they're responding to their environments and they have a genuine, real form of intelligence. So when we have the idea of non-existence, we should first understand in the ancient world that would have to do with a state of chaos or a state of nothing being usable. And that's confirmed immediately in the second line of this passage in the Tao when it says, "The way is as empty as an empty bowl, yet when used, it never fills." So the Tao stresses that emptiness is the condition of utility. So this is the first big idea, is that emptiness being the condition of utility means you have to have a relative state of a lack of order or of potential. And if you have potential and you don't know what it's for, it's fallow ground. Nothing's been done with it yet. And relative to order, that potential is a kind of chaos. You could bring different things out of it and you haven't brought anything out of it yet. And so chaos is therefore a kind of synonym for non-existence. And chaos could be really negative, like as the word is pretty negative, or we could use chaos in a sense to mean that which isn't ordered yet, okay? So there's potential, and potential is linked to what can become ordered, useful, living, but potential itself hasn't yet become, it isn't yet living. But you can't use a bowl if it's empty. I've got a mug here, right? I have coffee in it. I want to drink coffee, so I take a sip. The result is there's less coffee. If I keep drinking my coffee, as I love to do every day, I'm going to run out and the cup will be empty. At that point, I can no longer drink coffee. It's also the case that if my cup weren't empty in the morning every day, I couldn't have a cup of coffee. So this is the basic idea we see all the time of empty your cup, open your hand, let your hand be empty so that you can receive. It's true, it can seem trite, but it's frankly profound. And it's connected to what we're learning in the Tao Te Ching. But there's a lot more to this idea. It's a universal idea. If you think about every time you've been able to do something extraordinary, the state in which you existed prior to that thing happening, prior to receiving the thing, was a state of relative emptiness. And so if you think of emptiness as purely a bad thing, right? There's clearly a kind of emptiness which isn't good. That's what I would call a negation of fullness. So we're not talking about something hasn't come into existence and then we're talking about something where nothing has come into existence, but it could come into existence. When you have an empty bowl, you could put something in it, but you haven't yet. As soon as you put something into a normal bowl, you can only use the bowl for whatever you put in it, right? Otherwise, you're mixing everything up. And if you want to use your bowl for anything else, you're going to have to completely clean out the bowl. And what does cleaning mean? Cleaning means restoring something to a state of emptiness or restoring it to a state of pristine utility. So it turns out being ready and being usable and being empty are actually very deep metaphysical synonyms. That implies being used actively, being actively in operation, being clearly moving implies a state of fullness. Now, there's a great mystery about this, and if you've come these first 5 or 6 minutes, you'll get to begin to hear this mystery. The first thing I want to share with you right away is this is referring to your senses. Okay? So the way it says is as empty as an empty bowl, yet when used it never fills. Deep and ill-defined, it resembles the distant ancestor of all things. Deep and ill-defined, it resembles the distant ancestor of all things. So the Tao is associated with emptiness, and it's deep and it's ill-defined. Now, I want to start with your senses, okay? Most people have no conscious relationship with their sense organs. Right? Unless something happens to your vision or something happens to your hearing or unless something happens to your smell like COVID did to me when I got it one time. I lost my sense of taste and smell for a few days, which is very scary because I love food and I love, to be able to smell, and smell is one of our most powerful senses, right? But unless you've had something happen to it, you tend to not even think about it. So if you do think about your senses, most people don't have an easy way to define them. You would just say, I see with my eyes, but people haven't really thought deeply about the senses. And there's not a lot of good modern philosophy about the senses. I think the ancient philosophical traditions in China and Greece and many other places were a lot deeper because those people were much more sensorially engaged in some ways than modern people who spend a lot of time just reading books and using machines We're not as sensorially sensitive as our ancestors were. We're not as living and intelligent in our senses. But your senses are the source of your awareness and your insight. So relative to your awareness and your insight, your senses are distant to them. They're the actual source of them. So you're aware of me now because you're hearing me. But if you ask yourself, what does it mean to be hearing me? You'll realize that's a very difficult and deep question. So your senses are very deep things, and they're connected to the depths or the cavities of the body, right? Senses are connected to orifices or cavities, the sockets of the eyes, the emptiness of the ears that lead to the center, of that system where sound is so sensitively interpreted by the brain, the cavity of the mouth, right? So anywhere we have a sense, there is some emptiness. So emptiness as a root is correlated with awareness as an outcome or utility. So you could say the emptiness of the senses produces the usefulness of understanding or awareness or sensation. Now, the Tao says that the way is like an empty bowl, yet when used, it never fills up. Well, our senses are like this. You can hear things over and over and over again, but your sense of hearing doesn't get filled up or clogged, right? If it has the way. You can see things and keep saying things and saying things and saying things, and yet, unless it's really extreme, you don't have to stop looking. Now, we know this is only limited and relative in its truth, right? If you listen too much, too loud, your senses become overwhelmed. If you look at too much, your eyes become strained, or the light blinds you, or the darkness is too long in your eyes and you can no longer see the light anymore. But in general, the senses have this feature of being renewable. Now, we don't think about this. It's quite remarkable. And there's an emptiness that's filled, but then it's empty again. So once your ears hear something, it's like a bowl that, although empty, it's now used, but when used, it's now empty again, as if it was never used. This is quite extraordinary. So this indicates that your senses are not only have to do with an emptiness or a cavern, it has to do with a flow through that cavern such that the use of the senses somehow doesn't by itself exhaust them. That's quite extraordinary. And if you watch my last video about developing, for example, superhuman abilities through the search for wisdom, this is very much connected to that. So those of you who are watching both series, you're going to kind of get the most out of this, as well as my own students who are currently studying with me, who I use these videos and to give other oral teachings based on them. So the idea that the Tao is deep and ill-defined and resembles the distant ancestor of all things, I want to say, to start with, the way to understand that is your senses, your physical senses are a bit like this, okay? Now, we have many more senses than we realize. And I'm not going to enumerate all of them. For one thing, in every traditional spiritual tradition, you're not given a kind of comprehensive view of what the teacher or the system knows about the body until you're ready for that knowledge, so that it's useful for you and not harmful. So I'm not even going to begin to try to taxonomize all of the senses that have been itemized in different spiritual, scientific, and philosophical traditions, nor am I going to share how many senses I believe we have, or how many senses that you can be taught to use at in a relatively early stage of training, say within 10 years. I'm just going to start with the 7 senses that I think every person needs to know about, the 7 senses that every person needs to know about. And we'll see that 6 of these senses are obviously physical, and there's a sense in which the 7th sense is clearly physical too, but it makes the word physical a lot more difficult to understand. So I'm going to introduce the 7 senses, and then I'm going to connect them to the Tao, and that'll be the last part of the video, where there'll be a kind of, I hope, application, if you will, or opening of your understanding. So we have way more than 7 senses, just so you know, but I want to use the sense of senses in the normal way we think. So we have our 5 physical senses that people talk about. We have the sense of sight, and the organ of that is the eyes. We have the sense of hearing, and the organ of that is the ears. We have the scent of taste, and the organ of that is the tongue, and particularly its connection to the nose. We have the sense of touch, and the organ of that is the surface of our bodies, but specifically our hands and our lips, the extremities of the most sensitive and detailed parts of our bodies, the extremities of the most detailed parts of our bodies. So we have the sense of touch. And then, of course, we have the sense of smell. So these are the 5 senses. Now, I said there's 7 basic senses everyone needs to know, and this is, I would say, very scientific, although science, we don't have a total science of the body yet that people agree on. And so when I say scientific, I mean all of these things are written about by scientists, even if they don't categorize them this way. So the 6th sense is very important, and I teach this, is why I teach in my biosomatics program. I teach people martial arts. It's an essential part of training because you need to do martial arts practice to develop this sense. And that's our sense of proprioception, or some people would say kinesthesia. If you don't know what proprioception is, it's basically the capacity your body has to know where it's located in space. This is a very important sense. We know we have it. And so I call it the 6th sense. So and in the 6th sense of proprioception is, for example, if I close my eyes right now, I can touch my nose without looking. But if you think about that, how do I know how to do that? How do I know how to see where my body is in space relative to itself without seeing it, right? That's the sense of proprioception, right? If someone steps behind me, I can feel that. Everyone can if you're sensitive and if you're relaxed. And through martial arts and other forms of training, you can develop a really heightened awareness of your skin, and you can develop techniques that you can feel very subtle forms of air currents, all kinds of things, not just the energetic obvious things, but physical things. You can just, the sound crunching, the sound of people breathing, the feeling that people have when they breathe. When people breathe and they have the respiration activity, it's a lot of activity inside of the body. And so if another person is in your physical proximity and they're breathing, you can sense that even if you don't realize it yet. And that's like a basic form of the evolution of the senses that I measure, is it should be pretty easy after a certain time of training. If you're getting the right training, for example, in a kind of philosophical martial arts practice, you should be able to sense when other people are in a room that you're in, even if you didn't hear them. So that's an example of something that I think ultimately has to do with proprioception, is that we're aware of our body relative to space, at least relative to itself. But as I would going to suggest, you can extend all of the senses. And so if you extend the sense of proprioception, what you get is an extension of the capacity to know what is inside of the space around your body. And that's related to my concept of the soma, which is the fullest idea of the body, which I'm not going to explain right now, but that's what I specifically train in biosomatics, is I train the soma as I understand and present the soma. And so we don't train the physical body by itself, but we train the physical body as an instrument of the higher level body, the soma. So anyway, proprioception I think is related to the soma. That's how I think of it philosophically, but proprioception is a scientifically real, well-known sense, sometimes again called kinesthesia, the capacity to sense motion. But I don't think that's as good of a term as just, the idea that we are aware of our own body relative to itself in space. So it doesn't have to be in motion, you could just feel. But it's true that motion, you can say, is the sign that we have this sense that we can feel things and move things relative to ourselves. So that's the 6th sense, proprioception or kinesthesia. So what's the 7th sense? The 7th sense is related to what Aristotle called our common sense. And this is not what we mean by common sense, like the stuff we all agree on or we think is obvious. The 7th sense is related to proprioception, but at another level of abstraction. Okay, so think about the fact that I first learned about proprioception through reading Jonathan Sacks's, case studies and essays when I was in my late teens. Jonathan Sacks was a great scientist and writer, specialist in the brain and injuries to the brain, like aphasia and agnosia and other things. And he had a famous book I first read called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And I began to think philosophically and scientifically. I became very interested in these problems for their significance for what the senses were and what kind of senses human beings actually had, not just when they were impaired, but how impairment of the senses could teach us to remember. Maybe there's like ways we can train our senses that we've forgotten or that we could learn how to do, even if we didn't understand how to do it. And so I became very interested in proprioception. At that point, I began thinking about it in relationships to my martial arts training, which I began when I was 11 years old, 26 years ago now. And I've been meditating on these things and studying them practically in my physical practice and intellectual research for a long time. And so I realized to really understand the sense of proprioception, there's an obvious set of senses that are connected to it. And I'll just summarize all of them under this one term, the seventh sense, okay? So just to review, we got the 5 physical senses we know. We have the 6th physical sense we know about, but we don't think about a lot, which is proprioception, or kinesthesia, our awareness of our bodies in space and motion. And the 7th sense is, of course, the sense of time. Now, this is extremely important. And so I think we can think of it as a physical sense. The reason I don't claim it's a physical sense is because that then commits you to saying time is physical, and people will ask, what does that mean? And it's, of course, very obscure, difficult to understand. But if you didn't have a sense of time, you couldn't order any motion into something you could respond to. So we forget about our sense of time. And so I define, therefore, from the sense of time, I define the senses differently. Let's go backwards now. So we have 7 senses. We have the 5 common physical senses. We have the 6th sense, the sense so-called of motion, kinesthesia, proprioception. Proprioception is related to the Latin concept of proprium, which is very profound. It's where we get property attribute from. It has to do with that which pertains to yourself. And therefore, that's the deeper term to me. But kinesthesia is an interesting secondary way to think about the concept. And then I said the sense of time. Well, wait a minute. It's quite interesting that movement is associated with time. Aristotle famously defined time as the number of motion. That's Aristotle's description of time. Time is the number of motion. That's a great description of time, particularly from a scientific standpoint. So the definite measurement quantitatively, you could say, of motion is something like time from the counting standpoint. Now, time has, of course, other richer meanings as well. Plato's definition or description of time is the most profound ever given. He says time is the moving image of eternity. Time is the moving image of eternity. This is in the Timaeus. So if you think about time, time as a concept is essentially linked to motion. And motion as a concept depends upon space. And so I've always thought it's a complete mistake in modernity that space is made secondary to time. This is completely wrong. Time is very profound and it's highly articulated, but it's an articulation of the sense of space, right? So if you have time and space and you're debating is one more fundamental, many modern philosophers and scientists, and really it's one tradition, they have prioritized time over space. Like Immanuel Kant does this in his Transcendental Aesthetic and his Critical Philosophy, and it's a mistake. It's very profound, even the mistake, but it is a mistake. Space is the most fundamental thing. Without space, you don't have anything. Every idea is in a kind of space. Time has to assume space, or nothing is inside of anything, and nothing is moving through anything for anything to happen or for any time to pass. Okay? Now remember, the Tao said deep and ill-defined, so hopefully you like this level of depth, but in this series of the Tao, I'm going to talk at a much deeper level than I do when I teach Western philosophical material, because that material is frankly not as deep. And I like the Tao because it allows me to go directly to the level of depth I want to go, like when I teach martial arts or physical or meditative practices. So this is kind of a deeper level of what I myself love about philosophy that's hard for me to access directly when I'm sharing only Western philosophical traditions. So the Tao, in talking about deep and ill-defined, is like the distant ancestor of all things. I suggested we should think of the senses. And so then I said, well, we want to know what the senses are. And I said, well, there's at least 7 senses, okay? And I want to now redefine the 6th sense, okay? If you think of the 6th sense as kinesthesia, the sense of motion, then I would say proprioception implies the 7th sense, the sense of time. And indeed it does. In fact, all of the senses require a sense of time, right? If sound were just, there was a sound and then there was a sound and then there was a sound and then there was a sound, you could never hear anything. Hearing is hearing unified things that you receive as information from audible input. But if you didn't have something that was making sense of the audible input, you wouldn't hear sound at all. It would just be noise, right? In the way we talk about signal is the meaning and noise is just the meaningless background. So many people go through the world and the whole world is just noise. Some people go through the world and the whole world is signal. Most of us are in between. We're looking for the signal and the noise. Maybe we're confusing the signal and the noise, but we're basically stuck between a world full of a lot of meaningless stuff and some stuff that seems really important that we have or are looking for. And some people maybe are totally lost in the noise. There's nothing meaningful, total chaos, emptiness, everything, not even a bowl that there's emptiness inside of. And some people maybe are in a world in which there's everything somehow makes a kind of sense. There's a kind of fullness of understanding. So that would be a much higher being than we humans currently are, because we don't know stuff. So we have to study it. We have to learn science at great effort and practice. We have to learn philosophy. We have to learn to discipline our bodies. It takes a lot of effort and training. So clearly, a being that had all of that right at its fingertips would be a kind of much higher evolved version of us, if you even thought about it as something that we could become. And I think we can become that, and we are becoming that. So the Tao is part of the key to how we do that, and understanding the senses is key to transforming them. So if you thought of the sixth sense as kinesthesia, the sense of motion, I would say it implies the seventh sense, okay? If you think of the sixth sense in terms of proprioception, which is the deeper idea, the sense of your own ownness, and I won't go into this, but this is underlying all the senses, is that you have a sense of ownership of yourself. If you don't have that sense, the idea of the senses literally is incoherent philosophically. And most philosophers tend to ignore this totally, and that's why we have no real doctrine of property. Because modern philosophers in particular have no doctrine of property that makes sense, because property is a very deep concept and it's related to the concept of the senses. So you have to ground property in a proper doctrine of the body, otherwise it's just made up, philosophy justifying land grabs and stuff. So, and a lot of concepts of property are like that because they're not real. They're not rooted in the actual physical person. And as I said, I'm a spiritual materialist, meaning I think at a first hypothesis, you should always understand what is the material reality here. Let's assume it's all material. Let's look very carefully at the material itself. And so if you look very carefully at proprioception, you realize that it is really, I would say, the sense of space. And the sense of space implying also the sense of time. So the sixth sense is a physical sense, but I want to suggest I'm going to summarize the sixth and seventh sense are like ways of distinguishing the seventh sense, the sense of time specifically, or kinesthesia in its implied sense of time, proprioception in its implied sense of awareness of time. And the sixth sense, you could say, is specifically the sense of your own self as a distinct thing that belongs to itself. And that's actually what the sense of space is related to. So because you know that your hands belong to you, I can touch my body without seeing it with my other senses. Whereas if I didn't belong to myself, I wouldn't know where I was relative to myself. Now you could say, my gosh, this sounds so deep, but this is scientific. If you read some of the stories, for example, the cases from Oliver Sacks, you'll see he has patients who lost their sense of proprioception. This happens sometimes for people who will have a brain injury, and God forbid, they will then wake up, for example, and feel like their right leg is not their own leg, and they'll try to throw it out of the bed. So this is one of the stories that Oliver Sacks tells. A man, I think, who woke up and he didn't experience his own limb, I think his right leg, as his own, and so he was trying to get rid of it because he felt like some foreign person's leg was in his bed with him, not on him, but in his bed with him, right? So this is real. This happens, and so that led me down this path as I began thinking, wow, if we can lose that sense, what is it we're losing in the first place, right? And I basically been thinking about that for about 20 years, and also practicing it, like realizing there's all these things in dance or in martial arts traditions that if you think about kind of at a philosophical or scientific level, it's connected to the idea that you're actually trying to cultivate a higher form of sense itself. And that if you actually just practice that directly, you could probably transcend a lot of the lower level material, but by understanding it, where it's coming from. Because if we didn't have a sense of space and time, There are no physical senses. There's no physical world. So the physical world as we know it is the world of the dynamic interweaving of things in space and time. And therefore the five senses are the kind of most concrete, low-level manifestation or the specified manifestation of our sense of physical change relative to our body. So those are therefore the sixth and the seventh senses. And I think, and you could say, how do I know these things? Well, again, I've studied, I practice, and I've studied the Tao. And I'm suggesting to you, part of my understanding of the Tao is as I studied and pondered things, often for years without knowing what something meant, sometimes I would just realize, oh. And so I want to share with you, think about the Tao now. I'll read the verse again. The way is as empty as an empty bowl, like your senses. Yet when used, it never fills. Deep and ill-defined, you don't know where your senses come from, and you don't really know how to describe them. It resembles the distant ancestor of all things, some oneness very far away that we all come from. It blunts sharp edges, unravels their tangles, softens their blazing light, and blends one with their dust. This is beautiful, but I'm not going to talk about it today. But this is what understanding does. This is what sensing does. It distinguishes, unifies, makes smooth. Gentle and overflowing. It always seems to be there. I don't know who gives it birth. It appears to precede the creator of us all. So now let me end by telling you something about these sixth and seventh senses and how you can cultivate them. The first thing you can do is to cultivate the awareness that you have the sense. So awareness is the first way to train awareness. Awareness is the first way to train awareness. So I mentioned my cup, right? My awareness of it is either a distraction from me because it's irrelevant to what I'm doing, or it's useful to me. Okay, so awareness can be a distraction or it can be useful. If awareness is good for you, it's useful for you. So there's a useful kind of awareness that you need to direct at your senses, a useful awareness, okay? Not a distracting awareness. So I can ignore how the coffee tastes because I'm supposed to be talking to make a presentation for all of you. And in the course of that, I shouldn't be focusing on my personal sensual pleasure in my mouth. But in this case, I'm drawing awareness to the senses through the idea of becoming aware of the senses. And if you become aware of your sense of proprioception, like what you could say, all of your senses depend on this. If you think about it, I'm not going to go into that now, but logically think that through and you'll see it's true. All of your senses depend on the sense of proprioception. Then in order to train your senses, start by becoming aware that you can feel your body in space. Close your eyes and literally begin to become aware of feeling your hands. So again, there's exercises you can do that I teach people when I'm training around these kinds of things. And almost any form of martial arts, all soldiers, all dancers, they all do forms of exercises like this, even if they don't realize it's what they're doing. Because in order to be a good dancer, a good soldier, and in order to be good in a lot of things, you need to develop your sense of proprioception. But I train proprioception consciously, not that I'm a master of it, but rather I study it. I think Bruce Lee had an unbelievable kind of proprioception that he trained through what he did. So I think part of how you learn proprioception is you just look at people who have amazing abilities proprioceptively and try to just study them, imitate them. So that's a very good thing. If you've ever seen Bruce Lee doing the ping pong game with his nunchucks, that's real. It's just kind of astounding to watch. You can tell it's real, but his level of proprioception is unbelievable. If you've never seen that, check it out. I think we might have a clip of it here. So that's proprioception in action, at a very, very high level. And so to cultivate that, I want you to then become also aware of the sense of time. Now, this is something people tend not to ever think about at all, but you have a sense of time, and it's very hard to feel it because you can kind of feel your ears, you can feel your eyes, you can feel your tongue, you can feel your nose, you can feel your own skin, you can feel your own hands and fingertips, your lips. But you can't feel your sense of space directly, and it's even harder to feel directly your sense of time. And so here's a simple exercise I want to give you to begin to feel your sense of time, okay? First of all, I want to give you a true sense of time, which is based on the Egyptian cosmology, in which, let's say, true time is fullness, okay? True time is fullness, okay? This is a very old idea. It's not just the Egyptians, but they have this idea, okay? So true time is fullness, okay? And the enemy of time, or bad time, or time when it's being attacked, is deficiency, okay? So this is very important to know. What is time? Time is a sense of fullness, actually. Fullness of motion, fullness of growth. So time when it's being negated, time when it's being attacked, is a sense of lack, a sense of deficiency, sense of emptiness. Time in its proper sense is a sense of plenitude or fullness. So feel time, the feeling of the flow of time is the feeling of the undulation or the smooth movement, or sometimes tumultuous movement, of states of fullness and states of plenitude. And if you begin to feel, just don't think about time. Time is much too deep a term and too abstract and empty in name. There's a real God in every culture who's identified eventually with time, and that's the name. That's a concrete idea of time. But time as a word is like Zeus. It's just a general idea for this whole thing. And so as a general idea, you need something much more specific. So you should think of the fullness of your life, or the privation or emptiness of your life. And if you feel fullness and then consciously become aware of the detraction from that fullness, or states in which your life felt empty or deprived, that's feeling time's difference. That's feeling time in relationship to itself, the way the healthy part of your body feels your wound or your illness as a symptom of pain. Okay? So that's time feeling itself. That's the first way I teach that you can learn to feel time. Now you can do many things just with this, which are, complex and amazing if you begin to just meditate on it. But this itself is a very deep thing. And I'll tell you now one of the effects that will come of doing this, so that you know you're doing it. One of the first things that'll happen after you've been doing this for a long time, and a long time isn't a bad amount of time, it's just however much time doesn't feel immediately close to you. That's what I mean. In other words, you have to practice without being impatient. But if you practice this without being impatient, you'll start to realize a lot of things about your life, because the fullness of your life being contrasted with the negativity or darkness or detracted feelings of your life will give you insight into your life. And you're not pursuing this. I'm just saying, if you just do this exercise, becoming aware of time will become a certain type of increase in awareness and meaning in your life itself. So this is the practice of time, okay? And there's a whole practice behind this that's rooted in the practice of space, each of the senses, right? So rather than specializing in the practice of the five senses, which many of the great traditions do that, like in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and these are amazing and I respect all of them, but that's not my specialty. I've sort of gone a different direction because I discovered these things through the more universal sense itself of space and time, and that had to do with my being ill. I had so much pain on all parts of my body, and I was often immobilized that I basically was forced to endure incredible states of kind of stillness and also agony and awareness of all my joint system and in pain. But that pain then began, I used it to become aware. And that's where my own practice of these things emerged, just out of my many, many months, a couple of years total of my life being incapacitated because of the severe body covering disease that I had. And that's where I began to practice space and time, was in that condition. And so that's part of redeeming time. A great Jewish philosopher talks about the redemption of time. And that's a very deep idea. But to redeem time, we have to first practice it. So I hope that this has been an intriguing introduction to the profundity of the Tao Te Ching, verse 4, and that you have a sense now of what is at stake in the fact that the way is like an empty bowl, which even when it's used, it's as if it never fills up, and that it's deep and ill-defined, like the distant ancestor of all things. This I've suggested today is actually the beginning of a way to understand your senses. And when you understand your true seven senses, you'll begin to be able to practice the actual sense of time in a way that when you practice it enough, you'll begin just developing insight into your life itself. I'm Samuel Loncar. I'm the founder and the philosopher of the Becoming Human Project, a project to bring philosophy as a way of life to everyone, which I also do through my institutions, my speaking and my consulting. If you're interested in studying with me or hiring me to speak or to consult with you as an individual or your organization, I would love to hear from you. And in the meantime, I'd really appreciate it if you would like this video, subscribe to the Becoming Human Project, support it in that way, and share it with your friends and support me if you can. Buy my courses. You can support me on Patreon. You can support me on Substack if you want to read my writing as well. So I appreciate all of your support, especially the support of your kind attention. And I hope that this helps you have a deeper, more fulfilled human life. Thank you.